Okay, everybody. So, Daniel, I thought that was very efficient and full of really important things. I'm having to follow you, which is not ideal. Like following a strong presentation is never ideal. But we're going to talk about setting the stage. And anytime we do conference prep, this is just kind of a foundational conversation about how we think about what we do on stage versus how we deliver academic reports or how we would take the stage at an academic conference. So as Daniel mentioned, and I think I introduced myself more than thoroughly earlier, I'm Tracy Arrington. I do a lot of different things, but this type of work is my absolute favorite. I have a real passion for STEM, for this industry, for the diversity and inclusion that Daniel mentioned earlier, and really am a fan of how CII is pushing on those fronts. So our agenda for this conversation is really to talk about context, building really strong presentations for industry specific conferences, some definitely do's, some definitely don'ts, and then time for Q&A if anybody has any questions. So let's talk about context first. When we're preparing for presentations or any type of either hard deliverable or just oral deliverable, most people tend to think about what they want to say first. And we take lessons from marketers in that it's no longer about the person delivering the message. It's really about the audience, what their expectations are, what their needs are, who they are, and kind of crafting how we speak to them based on what their wants and needs are versus our own. So it's a little bit difficult, and the work I do with brands sometimes are like, well, we want to say, please buy Cheetos snacks. And you have to look at them and say, nobody says that. Nobody goes to the store and says, I'd like to buy some Cheetos snacks today. They say, I need a bag of Cheetos, right? So we have to be cognizant of who we're talking to and make sure that we're speaking their language. So things that we think about is, who are they? Why are they there? Like, what are their expectations for coming to the CII conference? What do they want from this? What matters to them? What are their remits when they go back, right? Because everybody that goes to a conference these days is debriefing a team, is writing up a report, right? There are some deliverables to show return on that investment for attending this conference. From a host standpoint, like, why is CII having this conference, right? Why don't they just send out emails with reports, right? What is the point of this? What are CII's core values? And how does your presentation work to support their values? Because this organization is, been around for a really long time. They spend a lot of time talking about their values and trying to live their values. So how does the work that your team is doing kind of support that? As I look at this slide, like, there should be a woman on this slide front and center. There are women in the left, but my goodness, talking about diversity and inclusion. But as far as audience segments, like who's making up the listening audience, we're looking at academics, industry leaders, and industry members. The background of the people in the audience is going to be pretty diverse. Many of them have common ground between them. But in their day-to-day remits, they could be pretty different. And while you will never be, the end-all be-all to every single human in the audience, we can do a little work to make sure that it resonates as strongly as possible with as many people in the room. When we talk about audience segments, we can also break this down by industry. So CII has 5 core sub-industry sub-segments: downstream and chemicals, manufacturing, life sciences, power utility infrastructure, facilities and health, upstream, midstream, and mining. And while these industries are quite different, we'll take another lesson from the marketing space. A lot of the best practices that you find, say in automotive, come from consumer packaged goods work, or in the insurance industry, come from healthcare, right? So when we talk about the content of our presentation, right, there will be meat to the story of every team's work. But when we package it up and present it from the stage, we want to think about, there might be people in the audience, not might, there will be people in the audience that come from different sectors. And so when we speak to business outcomes and how the work is going to positively impact things like risk and safety, revenue, project timelines, things like that, there are going to be people from other sectors that nod their head and say, this might be related to chemical processing. It's not immediately applicable to my particular role right now, but that's the kind of innovation we're seeking. How can we learn from what they've done? So I'm sure you all have these memorized. CII's core values. Here on the screen, things that make a lot of sense and why CII is an entity to begin with, right? Safety, productivity, predictability, efficiency, social and environmental responsibility, ESG type of things, obviously integrity and also ethics. So we all know that this group of people, these teams, are what's driving innovation in the industry. We know that this innovation provides measurable quantitative improvements in business outcomes. Whether or not they're being measured effectively is a different story, but by all entities, but they certainly have the capacity for that. And then also that CII is unique from anybody else doing R&D in that these teams are populated by academic leadership globally, right? You all are literally the best at what you do. This work is academically based. It is done in a very disciplined way that adds so much value and weight to the outputs. This is just a quick note about the environment. When we talk about conferences right now, even though we are kind of coming out of the height of COVID, if you will, it's still hanging heavy in a lot of people's minds. We're still seeing travel plans interrupted. Certain companies are still not allowing, especially senior level personnel, to make as many trips as they otherwise might have. Thankfully, that fog is lifting a little bit, but we know as we look at CII's conference, this could possibly be one of the first few events that people are attending. We've all been on somewhat of a lockdown for the past few years. So when we come to conference, we're really looking forward to a good time, right? To high engagement, to networking with other brilliant people, to gathering good ideas. One of the best parts of COVID, I think, is that it exposed a lot of gaps, right? And coming out of it, we're looking at how do we fill those gaps? Like there's a lot of reinvigoration for let's do the work that we had been putting off because life is short. So, leaning into innovation, leaning into these type of things. So networking should be very strong. Big opportunities for follow-up after the conference. We want to look at conference as an opportunity before, during, and after, right? There are so many ways, even, things that people don't necessarily think about as often in the engineering fields, even in the academic fields, like LinkedIn connecting with conference attendees and fellow team members or other teams just to build networks. That all contributes to the work being more robustly adopted, which is kind of the point. We want people to use our tools and our outputs. Okay, well, let's talk about presentations themselves. This term is one that I hang my hat on when it comes to this conference and many others like it that include more highly technical content or STEM related content. And it's the concept of distinct resonance. Distinct being really steeped in rigor, right? Everybody in the room needs to walk away from your presentation understanding that this information is coming from top industry leaders, top researchers. The rigor and the value of the output is not going to be readily available anywhere else. But the second part of it is the resonance side. When we are marketing or talking to people, trying to convince them that, you know, working through the change management process to adopt new ideas or processes or products is resonance. We're all people in the end. There is an emotional side to decision making, even if it should be very logical and clear cut. There are still, you know, there's still elements of emotions that will prevent people from moving forward with things that should obviously be put in place, right? People like to be comfortable. They do not like to be uncomfortable. I face this every day in industry. People, I actually had a C-level executive of a Fortune 10 company tell me, I know this work needs to be done, but I'm retiring in 2 years and I just want to do things like I've always done it and let the next guy or gal take the reins on making all this change. And I thought, oh my goodness, if your board of directors heard you say that, but you know, it was very transparent. It wasn't pretty, but it was how he felt. And so we want the audience to walk away from your presentations. Obviously, they're going to understand that your work is unparalleled, but from a resonance standpoint, we want them to take the work to heart. We want them to understand how valuable it is. And then we want them to recall it and if relevant to their role, apply it. So some of this is going to run parallel to things Daniel talked about earlier. But when we are preparing the deck that we're going to use on the stage, we want to make sure that the presentation is inspired by the research, but not a copy of it. Like, research is very text heavy. It's very highly technical. It doesn't translate well to an on-stage presentation. So we need to make sure that as we are crafting the narrative, the stage narrative, that it's inspired but not copied. We want to make sure we're generating excitement and interest from the start, right? And we'll talk about, as we work through rehearsals, ways to do that. But to get people to put their phone down, to get them to lean in, right? We don't want them to say, oh, well, you know, this is mining. I work in healthcare. Like, let me just, you know, work on my Wordle for the next 10 minutes. We don't want them doing that. We want them to lean in. We want to say, even if it's not directly in their line of sight for their role, we want to say, this is really interesting. I'm looking forward to this. We want to make sure the narrative throughout makes sense. You know, if it makes sense to you, not necessarily going to make sense to the audience. So some ways to work on this, and we're going to work on the narrative together and the flow of the presentations. But, you know, also a super simple best practice I have is to show it to somebody who's not involved in the work, and maybe not even in the industry per se, and say, does this make sense to you, right? I do that. My children are teenagers now. I'll give them my presentations. I'm like, tear this up. Let me know what you think. And there will be times where they're like, I don't understand any of these acronyms, but it makes sense to me, the flow of the story. And then from a closing standpoint, we want to make sure that we are active when we close. So not just say, here's the work and that's it. We want to include some slides that challenge the audience to continue to learn, to lean into the work, right? To look for copies of the full report, right? To download the full report, to download the tool, to follow up with the team at the events following your time on stage, right? We want them to, we want to recommend actions that people can take to continue to lean into your work. People kind of like to be told what to do, right? If you put the work out there, it might sit there. But if you tell people, download the full report, connect with us here, look for our follow-up webinar here, sign up for it today, people will nod their heads and take the actions. It's really interesting. Human behavior is a funny thing, right? People like to be led. If you leave it nebulous, they might not take the actions, but if you tell them, here are your next steps, 9 times out of 10, they'll take them. All right, visuals. We will have a graphic designer that's going to help with this, to help pretty things up, if you will. But we know that resonance dwells in visualizations, or visuals themselves, right? Photos, think about if you are introducing yourself, if you're talking about a business outcome, it doesn't necessarily need to be a linear visual. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't have to be the obvious choice, right? You can put a photo up there that people, turn their heads like, what in the world, right? I have a picture of John Wayne in a white hat on the back of a horse. And I talk about, Apple positions themselves as, the savior of the tech industry, like the guy in the white hat on the horse, right? When actually they're collecting data just at high volumes, just like Facebook and Google, right? But it's how they position themselves, and they do so in a really highly visual way. So, think about charts, graphs, but also think about including visuals that help to tell the story. There was a team last year that used photos, the Leaning Tower of Pisa and, the pyramids in Egypt, and, to kind of set their story as far as relevance. And this is not a new concept, but we're taking that tried and true concept and we're improving upon it. When we look at colors, the color palette's going to be set by CII. There will be a brand book, if you will, for the presentations. So as we are building within the slides, we just need to make sure that we don't build visuals that are really jarring up against the color palette that CII has in place. And then from an animation standpoint, we're able to embed video. Michael is masterful at working on integrating more complicated elements, but we also don't want to have excessive animation in the slides themselves, animation being different from video content, but we don't want people to be shocked by things flying around on the screen. Little comment before we move forward on transitions. We want to make sure that we are incorporating these in a really natural way throughout the presentation. So, the introduction should be planned, but not scripted. That first transition comes as you take the stage. There will be a video introduction, as Daniel said, with your photos, with your byline, and then you'll take the stage and begin your presentation. So we want to avoid scripts because they tend to come across as rather robotic, right? So you might rehearse things that you will want to say, but then you will have a natural ease if you give yourself a little leeway with that intro. if you're the very first team to present, this doesn't apply to you, but if you are a second team or a later team, having a reference to an earlier team's presentation or work is a really lovely way to tie the conference together and to show unity under CII's umbrella. And it also gets people nodding their head like, yes, I did notice that also. You know, now I'm looking forward to what you have to say. As we're working with maybe 3 to 4 members on the stage at a time, transitioning between one another, we have to practice, right? If we are, we don't know the technical setup yet. Are we holding microphones? Are we mic'd on our lapels? We need to make sure we practice those transitions. It seems like a small thing that you can just figure out, but if you don't practice, you end up fumbling on stage and then it detracts from the work. So that will be part of, you know, rehearsal on site, and we may talk about it in a later online rehearsal. At the end of the second bullet point, there's a note that says, avoid thanking one another as you transition. We're working with 45-minute windows, 15 minutes of which will probably be Q&A, so we're going fast. If we are thanking one another excessively, it eats up a lot of valuable time. And even though it is polite and lovely, we want to avoid that on the stage. And then transitioning to close. Your work needs to be the height of the presentation. So if you close with a phrase like, well, that's about it, or, you know, that's all we've got, I hope you learned something, all that does is deflate the excitement, right? And people will say, well, you know, we ended on a down note, right? We want to end on a high note, right? Going back to the talk about, here was our work, it is incredible, here are our next steps to apply this incredible work. Engagement options. We talked a little bit about mentee. We could talk about the logistics of what's going to go on in probably Cleveland, but we don't know the answers yet. So as we move through rehearsals, we're going to figure out, and Michael Burns is going to be pivotal in helping us understand what the lay of the land is at the conference, how we're going to engage the audience, right? Whether it needs to be exclusively digital, if there will be, you know, a mic pass around the audience, which I don't know will come back after COVID, but we'll see. Understand how that engagement is going to take place before you take the stage. And our team, Christy and Daniel and Michael, will do the legwork on getting that information for you. Seed questions. Daniel noted this in his presentation. Sometimes an entire audience will go completely silent when you ask for questions because nobody wants to go first. It's kind of hilarious, right? It's like the mob mentality. And then the first person goes, and then 100 people have questions right after. Nobody wants to go first. Everybody assumes someone else will go first. When I'm teaching online, I stare blankly at my students and until somebody will go first. They hate it. But, you know, seed questions help alleviate some of that anxiety for people, and also kind of extends the presentation a little bit. If there's something you really want to speak to, but it doesn't make sense in the narrative, we'll do that in seed questions. And then I mentioned earlier that conference engagement on places like LinkedIn. You know, CII has some must-dos with regard to putting shorter form versions of the work on the website and whatnot. But if it's allowed, speak to it in other places and connect with people to accelerate the work. All right, let's talk about the good stuff. So much practice. We're going to meet 3 to 4 times between now and the actual event, but please, please, please do practice on your own. Last year, we had teams that never practiced, and it really showed. And we had other teams that practiced, and my goodness, they came to our rehearsals and it was done and it was amazing, and everybody was happy and relaxed, and nobody was pulling their hair out because they felt like they were behind. So I know it's we're all crazy busy, but definitely carve out time for practice with the team itself before we have our rehearsals, if you're able to. It makes a big difference and makes all of this go much faster. It also shows on the stage, it really does. You all are collaborative in working on the projects themselves. So we'll apply that same rigor to prepping for the presentations. This slide is about style. I'm sure there are many of you on the call who have no qualms about getting on stage. You speak publicly all the time. That is amazing. But there might be other team members that don't do this very often, right? That might be a little nervous about this, or maybe used to speaking at academic events versus industry events, and might have a little bit of anxiety about it. I will tell you, I hope everybody's been to a CII conference before, but my takeaway of this conference as compared to hundreds of others, it's very welcoming. It's a place where you can show your work authentically and have it be well received. So the ways to make this easier on yourself from the stage: speak in a conversational style, right? Don't change your voice or change the tenor of your voice. Speak like you would to a friend, right? If you get robotic and stiff, people will read that as discomfort, which leads into people thinking you're being disingenuous, which obviously you're not, but it doesn't translate well from a resonance standpoint. So give yourself a little leeway to relax a little bit and talk to people like you would in an office or, over lunch. If you screw up, and everybody does it at some point, just move on. Don't call attention to it. Don't apologize for it. And definitely don't say anything self-deprecating, right? Don't say like, I'm so terrible at this, and I'm not good at this, or, maybe I shouldn't be up here kind of stuff. Of course you should be up there. Everybody makes mistakes, and just go right over it and keep on going. The last point here is to make sure that you are unapologetically you. If you stifle your personality on the stage, people can tell, right? Because your body language changes, and it actually damages the delivery of the content, right? So a lot of this is about being forgiving to yourself, showing yourself a little bit of grace on the stage, and kind of giving yourself permission to just be who you are, right? That's who we want to see. We don't want to see a robot. When we're on stage, we might be moving. Is anybody on the call a mover? I call them dancers, like when you're on the stage, because you're moving, you're left and right, you're forward and back. Chuba's got thumbs up, right? That is a state of comfort for a lot of people, including me. So don't be afraid to move, but definitely assess the stage before you present. And there will be in-person rehearsals at the conference set up for this. Last year, we had 2 available, and then we had private rooms for teams to do prep in those places as well. But we're looking at like how big the stage is. Are there chairs on the stage? Are they skinny bar stools? Are they big fat overstuffed chairs? Like, do we actually have room left and right? Like, how far back are the chairs? That kind of stuff. Because if you are a big mover and then all of a sudden you're kind of boxed in, between furniture and your teammates. We don't want that to be a point of anxiety for you, right? So getting comfortable with that stage itself physically is pretty important. When you are making a really important point, I want to ask you to come towards the audience, right? That's that lean in moment, right? Forgetting the really good details, the meat of what you're saying. It heightens the impact. So use that movement to make really important points. And then the last part about movement with 3 or 4 people on the stage, we don't want anybody running over each other, tripping. We don't want any like, oh, excuse me, sorry. Hey, Bob, here we go. We got to be careful about that. And we definitely don't want anybody to trip and fall. And sometimes when we've got technical equipment, there's wires taped down to the carpet and all that kind of stuff. So generally we ask that people only move when you're presenting as a team, only move when you have the mic, and we can work all this stuff out in the actual physical rehearsals. All right, Daniel talked about attire earlier. CII prefers business or business casual, team coordinated, but not matched. So decide as a team, are you going ties, no ties? But what I mean about matching is like, not everybody needs to wear a black suit, right? It's not a funeral. We don't want everybody to be in a uniform, right? But there is coordination that can and should be done before you guys come out. Make sure that you like your clothes. If you don't like your clothes, if you don't feel comfortable in them, it will show. So make sure that it's not a suit that you haven't worn in 3 years and you put it on and it's too big or it's too small, or man, I never really liked the way these shoulder pads looked, right? That impacts how your work is received, because if you're uncomfortable, the audience is uncomfortable. So make sure your clothes fit you well and that you like them. Another note on attire, we won't know till we get closer to the presentations what the furniture situation is going to be like, but you know, sometimes on stage there are those big, huge, giant, comfy chairs, which are great, but if they're low to the ground and your female presenters are wearing skirts, this could prove to be a problem, right? Oftentimes, people don't think about that. But as thankfully we have more diverse folks on stage, we need to be careful just to make sure that everybody is given the opportunity to be comfortable and not set themselves up for what might be embarrassing. All right, here's some don'ts. Let's not do this in PowerPoint. Let's not use really tiny visuals, right? If there is a chart or a graph that you cannot read from across the room, don't put it in your slides. All it's going to do is frustrate the viewers, and they're going to stop listening to you because they're trying to figure out what in the world is in this visual, right? And we want them to listen to you because what you're saying is the most important part. Don't use a rogue template. CII has one. So don't put a ton of time and attention into building out a separate template because it's going to have to be redesigned anyway. So focus on the meat of what you're saying, focus on the work. It'll keep everything consistent team to team and save you a bunch of time. Don't put too much text on slides. This is the hardest part for everybody. This slide has too much text on it. If I was running this from a stage, too much text. I have a sign in my office that says edit ruthlessly, which is the hardest thing to do. It's so easy to write long, wordy slides, and it's really hard to edit them down to be so light. But think about, again, wanting people to pay attention to you. If you're speaking, what you're saying should be the most important thing. The slide is just there to support you, your work, your innovation. We don't want people just relying on the slide and ignoring what you're saying. Anything lengthy can be submitted as a leave behind or in the full report. And we'll put that as a next step, like please refer to the full report for additional details. And then back to transitions, make sure that you have transitional slides to give people support for your narrative and help them to see the priorities through your presentation. Transition slides also help you pace, right? So like last year we had a team needed 25 minutes for the presentation, 10 minutes for Q&A, and their content was 48, 50 minutes long for the first few rehearsals because they weren't pacing at all. They couldn't tell when they were running long because they weren't watching the clock, right? Those transition slides, like we can set some parameters to say, we need to get through this section in 5 minutes. We need to get through this section in 7 minutes. It helps to keep you on time, then you don't have to worry about it. All right, don't do this with your body. Don't ever turn your back on a stage, right? It is one of the most common mistakes people make on a stage is turning their back to the audience to read a slide. I promise you, everybody in the audience knows how to read, every last one of them. And turning your back takes all of your momentum away. So make sure that you don't do that. Try to avoid pointing. Pointing again brings the attention to the slide and takes it off of you and what you have to say. Also, culturally, pointing is considered pretty rude. And so in general, we don't want to do that on the stage. Careful about clasping your hands. If you study the work of jury consultants, it's really fascinating to see how they read body language, right? And we're all a little bit uncomfortable on stage if we're not speaking, right? As you're standing there while your teammate is speaking. But avoid like crossing your arms, clasping your hands, I'm struggling with this word, I apologize. Clasping your hands in front of you. Those movements show that you are closed off, right? That you are not happy to be there. And it might be just you're nervous or you don't know what to do with your hands. But we want to be mindful of this and practice this. If you can be purposeful, stand with your arms by your side. And it seems a little awkward, right? Because we don't generally do that day in and day out. But on the stage, try to make sure you're not crossing your feet, not closing yourself off with your body language, with your hands. And then last note, please, please, please do not lock your knees when you are on stage. I had somebody 3 years ago at a tech conference in San Francisco pass out because he locked his knees. And that was not a good thing. So make sure you don't do that. And then also when you're standing, the best posture to be in is to stand with your feet shoulder width apart. Women tend to stand with their feet completely together because we're taught that's what ladies do. It actually takes some of your power away from you when you stand with your feet close together because you become more diminutive. And so lots of research, lots of data shows that the power position with the most respect is standing with feet shoulder width apart. Not ballet wide width apart, but shoulder width apart gives you the most powerful body language, which we definitely want when you're on stage. All right, don't do this with the presentation. Don't forget to tell them why you're there. Like when we're talking about a really good opening statement, right? Why should you care about this? Why should you be excited about my work, right? This is why. This is what it's going to do for you. We know these are your pain points, and this is why we did the work in the first place, to help solve those pain points. Don't load up the dais. We talked about this already. looking for ideally 3 to 4 folks. We don't want 25 people on the stage. That's just too many. I don't know how big the stage will be, but it won't be that big. Even if it was, no to 25 people on stage unless you're a choir. But definitely acknowledge these teams, because there are so many people that contribute to the work that you do, and invite the audience to acknowledge them as well. Definitely don't use your presentation to try and prove you're smart. You wouldn't be allowed on the stage if you weren't top of your game and brilliant. So avoid putting like a full CV up on a slide. Avoid listing 25 job titles or awards or recognitions. People can find that information in other places, on LinkedIn and such, on your website, faculty pages, whatever the case may be. And then last but not least, don't load up with the deck with information that doesn't need to be delivered from the stage. If it is more appropriate in a final report, let's keep it there, right? Speaking decks should be really lean. You, the team, are the highlight of the presentation, right? The deck is there as support. Let's edit ruthlessly, and let's make sure that the meat is there for the people that want the deep dive, but that everybody in the audience gets the value from your presentation itself. Okay, this may be the most important slide. We are almost done. Please do not run long. It is considered the biggest faux pas in all of public speaking, is to run over your time. And primarily because it takes time away from people that are presenting after you. It also is considered disrespectful to the audience, who may be timing a bathroom break, timing a lunch, timing a conference call, in between presentations. So nobody ever intends to run long at all. But when we talk about rehearsals, practices, transition slides for pacing, this is why, right? We want to make sure that we are the best possible teammates for our immediate teammates, but also our teammates that are doing other presentations at CII. All right, that is setting the stage. Does anybody have any questions? I have multiple screens, so I'm not looking at you. No questions? All right.
They'll probably follow later.
Thank you, Nancy. Nancy is still alive. I am the same way. I generally need to digest information before I have any questions to ask. But, a lot of this we're going to work through as we run rehearsals and as we get closer to the actual conference itself. And, all of this stuff, it's tactical, some of it, strategic, other parts of it. But really, it's just about supporting you and supporting your work. CII wants to give really great conferences. When we first started working together, there were a couple people that were like, listen, our conferences are boring. We need to make them better. And I thought, well, that's pretty amazing, but also shows a commitment to improvement, optimization, right? As somebody who works in digital transformation, like that's every day, right? And we can all be better. So I admire that about CII, that they want this to be the best possible experience for their research teams, for the industry members, and for the people in the audience. Yes, I will absolutely send a copy of the presentation out. Christy, I'll ship it to you as soon as we wrap. If you wouldn't mind helping me get that out to everybody, that would be great. Yes, and like I said, I'm here to support you. I'll be at all of the rehearsals. Last year I was there in person. I think that's the plan again this year. for me to help with those in-person rehearsals as well. So if you guys need me in any capacity, I am here, and grateful to work with you. Thank you for your attention today.